Welcome to Boldmethod IFR Live. Tonight we're going to be talking about cloud tops. We're going to look at how to find cloud heights using a couple different reports and forecast systems. We're going to start by looking at the FAA's new graphical, or not the FAA, the National Weather Service's graphical area forecast, or GFA, which replaced the old school area forecast. Then we're going to take a look at pilot reports. We're going to look at the color IR satellite that you can get on tools like ForeFlight. And then we're going to take a final look at the skew-T log P diagrams. I'm Alex Uders. I'm a co-founder here at Boldmethod. I'll be presenting tonight. Colin Cutler, my business partner, is running as producer and also managing the chat. This is an interactive show, so the entire point is to answer your questions. As I'm moving through this tonight, if you have any questions, you want me to go into more depth or talk about stuff that you see here on the iPad, just let me know. We'll work them in throughout the presentations. Please don't save everything all the way out through the end. And then again, this has been asked a few times, this presentation will be available. We keep them all up on YouTube so that you can watch them then as time goes on. Okay, so right now, cloud tops always seems to be a winter thing, and that's because for most of us IFR pilots, we don't mind being in the soup as long as it's not convective, but we definitely don't want to be in the ice. And we got a reminder of that. This right here was Boulder. This is a block down from our office this morning. We had near record snowfall. In fact, I think we had almost record October and November, and it has definitely been a bit of an icy month for us. So even though our aircraft is de-icing equipped, even though we can operate into known icing with some limitations, we're always looking for cloud tops. And people say, well, can you fly IFR in a non-icing approved airplane in the winter? And the answer is absolutely. If the clouds are not forecast to or expected to produce ice, if known icing is not an issue, then you absolutely can operate inside of clouds. And especially as the weather gets colder and colder, as you enter areas like the northern US, where those clouds are very cold, they're essentially ice crystals, you're still able to fly through the clouds. But again, we don't always want to spend all of our time sitting in them. We want to get above them. And it can be a real challenge to figure out where those tops are. And part of that's because, well, our forecasts are pretty good at identifying the bases. They're really bad at identifying layers and the tops of stratiform clouds. And that's what we're really focused on today. We're not really going to deal with cumulus or thunderstorm cumuliform clouds today. That's a topic for a different show, but more stratiform, large-scale cloud systems. That's what we're going to be focused on here. Again, we used to have the area forecast, the old textual area forecast, and I felt like that did a fairly good job of identifying cloud tops. And there's a reason. Each forecast office had a forecaster that would be working on those area forecasts. Okay, so the area forecast had a real NWS forecaster adjusting for the local conditions. Okay, adjusting for the local terrain and weather, using those models, but then applying them to their location and their expertise, and using their judgment to generate cloud tops. And while AI has come a very, very long way, numerical models are not perfect, but it's expensive to have forecasters running area forecasts. So the National Weather Service has moved to the graphical area forecast. Now, there's a lot of advantages. Number one, the fact that it is much easier to see things because it's graphical. You don't have to read it, but there are some disadvantages. And one of the biggest is that it is entirely based off the rapid update or NWS models, okay? And because of that, there is not a forecaster involved. There's no human who looks at that and says, I don't know, I think the cloud tops will be a little higher, a little lower. I think the rain's going to move this way. It's 100% model driven. It does not have any human intervention. And so in my mind, it tends to work on large scale systems, but localized weather can definitely be off, and you need to regard it with a grain of salt. If you've never been there, we'll jump over to the iPad. Works pretty well on an iPad, works fine on a computer. You can find it at aviationweather.gov/GFA for the graphical area forecast. This tool or product changes all of the time. It is not on a set schedule. So you can find out about the forecast product itself by clicking this info button in the top right. They actually go through each of the different products in here. It's really important to keep in mind, when we were operating the old school aviation weather products world, you had the aviation weather products book that you got from the FAA. Things changed fairly infrequently. This product changes all the time. You'll see new stuff added to it all the time. So we'll jump back to it. I'm going to show you where we go for clouds, and then we're going to look at a storm that happened yesterday. So first of all, I'm going to zoom in so you can kind of see the Colorado area here. And you can expand that with this button in the top right to take up the whole screen. And I'll pull that back down. But along the top, we have these buttons. You can see I've just selected clouds. Initially, it's going to show your coverage. And you're going to notice it does two things. It gives you both these little observation symbols and then overcast and top. So the actual lettering or the textual description of what they're expecting. And then it's got graphical color-coded regions. So this right here is the coverage. Then we can also look at the bases by clicking on the left, the base button, and we can look at the tops by clicking on the tops button. Again, this is model-driven forecast data. This is not an observation. And then there's a slider that you can pull over and actually move to different times and look at this model. And these rapid update models, or the rapid refresh models, are changed or updated every hour. So essentially, you could think about it as an hourly picture of what the model predicts will happen to the weather. So hour-long granular increments, which is a lot more accurate than you would see in a traditional textual-based area forecast. So it goes into more detail there. Okay, this is really something that you kind of just got to play around with. But let's take a look at what we were able to pull out with the storm yesterday. So we'll go back to the iPad, and we're going to focus on the cloud top section. So what we talked about, we're going to look at a couple different areas here. We're going to look at the Denver area right here. We've overlaid the airport names, so as we move between parts of the chart, you can see where we're going. And we're going to look at Cheyenne as well. So the first thing that you can see, and I'm going to pinch to zoom in here, if we look at the Rocky Mountain metro area, you're going to see, again, we've got their forecasted tops, both color-coded, and they give us a textual point-based, grid-based value. So what it's saying here is they're expecting overcast bases at 9,000 feet with tops at 31,000 feet, flight level 310. Okay, and you can see that color matches up. So if we look at that orange, that's the orange there. So it's above 30,000. The yellow starts at 18,000, or you could say the light green tops out at 18,000. I find that the color is good for kind of gaining a visual picture of where the cloud tops are expected to rise and where they're expected to drop off. I find that it's also easier to read the textual parts once I know what area I'm looking at. But I like looking at the color because the color just gives me an idea of, okay, higher clouds are going to be out to the west, and it looks like the southeast is going to be improving. And we can just kind of see that here as I zoom out. You could see if I was operating in the Denver area and I was stuck and couldn't get above the clouds here, going north just from looking at the color is not going to help. Going south might help, but really in this case, going east is my fastest path. And I can tell that both by the color and by the data. Keep in mind, all of the numbers that you see here are MSL altitudes. This is not AGL. Everything here is MSL. Okay, so that's our most basic forecast. And as a general aviation pilot, that's really the only, commonly available aviation forecast that we have for cloud tops. There are a couple other tools that we can use, but they're not nearly quite as intuitive. That right there is our basic starting point. As we move on from here, everything that we do is going to be either, with the exception of the SKU-T, the next couple items are going to be observations. Okay, so forecasts are modeled. Observations are based off of real-time happening now information. And so keep in mind, well, forecasts may be wrong because the model doesn't work out. Observations can get old. Okay, or they're going to be a combo of observations and forecasts. So let's take a look at the next most common thing, and that's right here. We've got it on ForeFlight. It's a pilot report. Okay, so as pilots, cloud bases and tops, one of the most accurate ways to figure these out is a pilot report. And so you can see here, if you're unfamiliar with this icing symbol, they picked up light ice. That's what the single line means. Moderate ice would be the 2 lines, and severe ice would be the 3 lines. What I love about ForeFlight and other electronic flight kits, whether it's Garmin Pilot, FlyQ EFB, all of them do a great job of telling you how old a pilot report is, which is really important. So we'll go through this quickly. This is it was filed under Rocky Mountain Metro, BJC, routine pilot report over Rocky Mountain Metro, BJC, at 2233 Zulu at 7,000 feet MSL. It was a BE-20. That's a King Air Beech 200 King Air. The temperature outside at that altitude was -3 degrees Celsius. They picked up light rime. Okay, so here's our first problem with a pilot report. Oftentimes, we're glad to have any of them, right? As a pilot, this helps me out. I know that, okay, in that point, at that altitude, I've got ice, but I don't know where the cloud tops were. I don't know where the bases are. I don't know where the icing layers are. I just know what's happening at a specific altitude. So let's take a look at another one. This is coming into DIA. It's older, 57 minutes old. Denver routine pilot report over the DEN VOR radial 360 at 20 miles. Now, honestly, I doubt the crew actually plotted this. I'm assuming they're probably saying we were 20 miles north of Denver. That's probably how that got reported. But when it's that round, it usually is a crew saying, yeah, we're 20 miles north of Denver. Time 21:59 Zulu. Altitude 10,000 feet. Type an Airbus A319. Temperature outside was -12. Icing, light rime. Remarks, light rime in clouds from 10,000 to 12,500. 10,000 feet to 12,500 feet. Okay, so now that leaves me with a question. Were the cloud tops at 12.5 or was the top of the ice at 12.5? Both pieces of information are really useful. One of the interesting things, again, in the winter when we talk about cloud tops, again, we're normally talking about icing hazards and trying to avoid or stay out of or get out of icing layers. It's important to keep in mind that icing layers are very difficult to predict. That an icing air met is typically going to cover a wide range and a wide range of altitudes. And while it may forecast moderate ice, you will find areas of no ice, light ice, moderate ice, possibly even severe ice, all inside of that large air met area. Icing is notoriously difficult to predict unless you're looking at a thunderstorm and then it's guaranteed you're going to find it. So one of the things to keep in mind in stratiform clouds is that icing bands generally only last around 3,000 feet. So if you climb 3,000 feet or descend 3,000 feet, the icing intensity will generally change. It could get worse, but it could also get better. So again, as a pilot, it's something that we're always using our judgment for. If I'm stuck in moderate ice at one altitude, I'm not going to stay there. I'm going to climb, at least 2,000 to 3,000 feet up, or if I can and it's warmer, maybe go down, whatever seems to be the best based off of reports to try to change things up and find lighter icing. I don't sit. I wait till I find better icing. But again, with this report, what we do know, going back to the iPad, is that that the icing was between 10,000 feet and 12,500 feet. MSL, you just don't know where the cloud tops are. So above 12.5, you may still be in the clouds, but out of that icing band, again, that definitely helps. But the only way to guarantee you're not going to pick up ice is to get back into clear air. Okay, so the next great tool is the Color IR satellite. This is a tool that I would say is a bit underutilized. So most IFR pilots have seen it or heard about it. They've talked about it. They know that they probably should be using it. The problem is it's not nearly as intuitive and it requires some switching around. And so you really need to make sure that whatever EFB you're using, that you have their weather legend data saved down to your documents folder. So if you're using ForeFlight, I saved the ForeFlight mobile guide to weather inside my documents folder because I'm going to need to look at the legend. On ForeFlight and some other EFBs, you're not able to overlay the legend onto the screen, which I think is a major disadvantage. But at least you've got the data. So there's two things that we need to use when we're looking at a Color IR satellite and you're trying to use that to determine cloud tops. We need to know, first of all, what colors correspond to what temperatures. color IR satellite essentially measures the temperatures at the topmost layer of clouds. And then it color codes that so you can figure out what that top part of the cloud's temperature was. Okay, so, and again, it's delayed slightly, but it's an observation, not a forecast. So when it analyzed those clouds, when the satellite saw it, that's the temperature. Okay, so that'll tell us what the cloud temp is. Now we need to figure out what the temperature profile is in the altitude. So, in that area, what's the vertical temperature profile? That part is typically a forecast. When you use the winds or a skew T log P in ForeFlight, you're not getting an observation, you're getting a forecast. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So when we use color IR satellite, we're really combining an observation, the satellite, with a forecast, the winds aloft model. Okay, so let's start with this. And we've overlaid these. We'll start by looking at Cheyenne. What I've done is I've put a couple things up here. Number one, this right here is taken out of ForeFlight's Color IR Weather Guide, and it's going to tell you what temperatures corresponds to what colors. Then we've laid it just right next to it, this area right here, we just clicked on Cheyenne right there, and this is the forecast winds aloft for 5 o'clock p.m. yesterday as the winter storm was starting to move in. Okay, so let's zoom in and try to tie the two together. And again, you got to try to match the color up. So that's a big arrow. We'll shrink that down a little bit. Looking at the color right there, that looks like this bar to me. I'm going to say this negative 44. Okay, so CYS looks like it's around negative 44 Celsius. So now we're going to go over to our winds aloft forecast, and we're going to look for negative 44 and negative 43 right here at 27,000 feet. So I would say those clouds are slightly higher than 27,000 feet. Okay, let's go back and see what the forecast model from the GFA said. So satellite saying 27,000. If we look at here, south of Cheyenne, 21,000. North of Cheyenne, 32,000. So those two in this case are really lining up. At this forecast time, Cheyenne's 27,000 measured by the satellite. Again, the wind data is modeled, so there's a little bit of error there, but it's usually fairly accurate. And it seems to be lining up with the model that we see coming out of the graphical area forecast. So those two are kind of confirming each other. Again, keep in mind the winds aloft data that we're using is still a forecast. So and they can be susceptible to the same errors. So you can run into a little bit of trouble there. Okay, let's take a look at it again now in the Denver area. Do that one more time. So here's Denver. It's a little bit lighter blue. So again, if we go to the lighter blue, I'm going to say negative 40. What do you think, Colin? 40 or negative 36?
Yeah, I would say it looks like a little bit of both. Just north of Denver kind of looks like that 40 band. Just south looks like maybe that 36.
Okay, so we're somewhere between 36 and 40. Okay, and if you look at that, it's going to put us somewhere in between 24 and 27. Okay, that's what I'm saying. What do you think, Colin? Do you agree?
Yeah, I think you're good on that.
So 25, 26. Let's relate this back to what I know about my airplane. Okay, I'm flying in a Cirrus SR-22 Turbo often. I have a maximum operating altitude of 25,000 feet. In an emergency, I'm sure I could get the airplane higher, and if I absolutely had to in an emergency, I would do it. If going lower was not a safe option, I'm sure I could probably squeeze 1,000 feet out of it in an emergency. What I know is Cheyenne, with those tops of 27, I'm not getting out of those. Denver, I'm 24 to 26. Maybe I might be able to get out of them, but again, that temperature model is not perfect. And so, don't look at these clouds down to the 1,000-foot level. I mean, even 4,000 feet might be kind of a granular thing. So, there's a chance they'll break out there. If we take a look at the graphical area forecast and see what that was predicting, what you see here is that tops were forecast over or right northeast of Denver at 14,000 MSL, okay? But then between Denver and Rocky Mountain Metro, which is what, 10 miles?
Probably like 10 to 15, probably 15 to 20 miles.
Okay, yeah, probably about 7-minute flight in our airplane. So 3.5 minutes between, it's 7 minutes between Centennial and BJC and about 7 minutes between Denver and BJC. So about 3 minutes flying just a little bit west, you can see how quickly those clouds climb. So what I think here is the satellite's obviously probably fairly accurate, and what's happening is this weather has just moved a little further east than forecast, right, Colin?
Yeah, you're exactly right, and that's exactly what happened yesterday as the winter storm was moving in.
So this is something to think about. Again, one of the advantages that we can grab from a color IR satellite is that it helps validate the forecast, and we really need to use the two in concert. The forecast and what I'm seeing on satellite makes sense. This weather was moving through and changing rapidly. And so while the forecast said, I don't know, Denver, you should be able to climb out of it, 14,000 feet going east, no problem. What I'm seeing on the satellite is that it already started to move in. And I probably was not going to be able to get out of those clouds over Denver. And one other thing to keep in mind, temperatures close to the surface are greatly affected by heating of the earth, cooling of the earth. As you start to get up into the flight levels, that's much less of an effect. And so, the temperatures on the surface can cool considerably as you start to go through sunset. Obviously winter, that happens at about 3, it seems. But the surface temperatures drop off fast as you lose the sun. As you go up into higher altitudes, those temperatures hour to hour are going to be more stable. Okay, looks like we've got a question.
Yeah, so Jim wants to know this with regard to the images we've been looking at. What happens if there's more than one cloud layer with the color IR image?
Okay, Jim, that is the big limitation with it. Okay, so that's what we're about ready to get to here. And the problem that you run into is that it's only going to tell you where that top layer is. So if you've got a cirrus layer overriding the top of the storm, you're stuck. I mean, that's all the satellite's going to see. It's got absolutely nothing. Okay, so you've got to use your judgment a little bit and try to determine if cirrus is a factor or not. And there's a couple ways you can identify that. We can actually look at the clouds on the satellite and see if they look like cirrus clouds, so that can be hard to see sometimes. You can look at the altitudes they're at. Cirrus clouds are typically not at 14,000 feet, so that's not it. But if you've got a high cloud layer, let's say 25 to 30 or higher, the question is there space in between that you can fly the airplane? Satellite won't tell you. The graphical area forecast is going to say layered too. In fact, I think I can find an example. Colin, if you zoom in here, you can see we have a few here around Cheyenne where it's saying tops at 23 with cirrus above. So it's trying to identify that for you. And here you can see this one says overcast at 9, layered to 30,000. Okay. But, again, it really doesn't give you any idea of how thick those layers are or where the holes are. Okay. So, again, this is why PIRAPs are such an important thing. I can guarantee you there were people coming in and out of the area yesterday that saw the beginning, the tops of the clouds, the tops of the icing layers. It's something Colin and I try to report all of the time because for piston pilots, it is so important. A lot of turbine aircraft aren't as worried about climbing through the ice. Piston aircraft are much more power limited. We don't always have the capability, even if we're icing certified, to climb through significant amounts of ice. And so knowing those tops is important. But the last option, which takes a little bit of research and practice and is not always super helpful, is using a SKU-P log-T diagram. We're going to do a thing on summer and thunderstorm use for SKU-P log-Ts here in the future, but right now we're just going to talk about stratiform clouds and how to use them. So remember, we talked about the fact that model data that you see for winds aloft, that's still a forecast model. And what happens is, I think there's 60-some points. We looked it up. 67 points, Colin, in the conterminous US?
I think there were
13 in
69. 69 in the CONUS, and then 13 in Alaska.
1 in Puerto Rico.
And then some out in the Pacific as well.
And 9 in the Pacific. Yeah, these are the points where the National Weather Service launches a radiosonde. So, right, the weather balloon that goes up that somewhere in New Mexico that someone thought was a UFO, Those radiosondes are how we start to develop our upper air models. They are the primary source of information for the model of air and temperature in the United States. So all this forecast information you see, that's all being driven from the information coming off these radiosondes. And they're launched twice a day, up to an hour before 0 Zulu and up to an hour before 12 Zulu. So twice a day. And if you really think about it, that basically means there's maybe 1 to 2 inside each of the conterminous U.S. states, quite a few more in Alaska. But really, there's not a lot of these radiosondes. They're not going up everywhere, and they only go up about every 6 hours or so. In significant weather events, they may launch them slightly more frequently. But again, we're relying on a forecast model. So when we talk about a skew P log T diagram that's current, we say, what's the current diagram looking at? Keep in mind that we're still looking at a forecast model, and the data may or may not be the same data that was used to drive the graphical area forecast or the winds aloft forecast. So you definitely, if there's errors in one, it can make its way through a lot of other ones. But let's take a look and see what this does. So we're going to jump. I use SkewT Log P Pro. It's a fairly inexpensive iPad and iPhone app, and it allows you to pull a SkewT Log P chart from National Weather Service data, actually all over the world. So it uses a lot of global meteorological groups. So if you've never seen one of these before, what it really is just showing you is the temperature and the dew point and how that changes with air or with altitude. And really, a meteorologist is going to use pressure levels in millibars, not altitude in thousands of feet MSL. They're going to work in pressure levels in millibars. But pilots, oftentimes we're more interested in the thousands of feet MSL. So you can see your pressure levels or altitude is horizontal here. The red line is your temperature, and the blue line is your dew point. And the reason we call it a SkewT Log P is that you'll notice these red lines, and I'm going to kind of highlight a couple for you so you can see them. These red lines right here, I'll make that a little bolder, that you see me going through right here, they're skewed. Okay? And when we call it a log P, the pressure lines that you see here, so 900, 800, 700, you can see how the spacing changes as we go up. That's because as you climb in the atmosphere, pressure starts to, we say 1 inch per 1,000 feet. Well, that's accurate at sea level. But as you start getting higher and higher and higher, the pressure change is less per 1,000 feet of altitude. So essentially, a SkewT Log P uses a logarithmic scale for the pressure, and then it skews the temperature off at an angle. And the reason it does this is because we can trace along these lines and figure out convection levels and lifted indexes, and it makes forecasting and predicting thunderstorms much, much easier. So this is almost like a fundamental tool for a meteorologist when they're looking at convective activity and weather patterns. And it can show non-convective activity as well, stratus formations, fog, all kinds of stuff. So today, let's go back to it. We're going to just talk about clouds and try to figure out the basic stratiform cloud. Again, we said that the red line, I'll go back to the yellow arrow here. The red line is temperature, the blue line is dew point. And that's really important because in a cloud, essentially you have 100% relative humidity. The air is saturated, okay? So when the air is saturated, the temperature and the dew point should be the same. So when we're looking for a stratiform layer on a SkewT Log P chart, what we want to find is areas where the temperature line and the dew point line are the same or extremely close. Keep in mind, when the radiosonde went up, it might have gone through an area where it was clear, but right next to a cloud, it was just about, maybe just a slight bit, just a % off from forming a cloud. But you could still call that part of a layer. So we want to find areas where they're very, very close. And if we zoom in, you can see that here. And I'm going to leave this, I'm going to kind of skew it over here. You can see right about, draw an axis. They kind of collide right about, right about there. Okay. And they break apart maybe right there, but they still stay fairly close. So I might even say that really they don't really start to separate until right here. Okay, that's where you really start to see the temperature and dew point separate. So you can see that how they collide. It's a big arrow, okay. How they collide right there, and then they stay fairly close. And then right here, they really start to diverge, okay? And if you look as you go up, they really never collide and diverge again. The relative humidity never really hits 100% again inside of the model here. So what you could say is in this case, the ground is what, probably around maybe, if you look at, we're probably around 7,000 feet, Colin, would you say, for bases? And tops just above 10,000 feet?
Yeah, that's exactly what you're looking at here. Yep.
Somewhere in that area.
Yep.
And this is for, I put the name, Cheyenne here. So let's go back to Cheyenne and just see what the forecast said. Overcast 6, tops 21, but you can see if you get here into this green, okay, overcast 9, and there's in the green.
If you go left toward Denver, there you got an overcast 8.
There you go. Yeah, overcast 8. So in certain areas, these two agree. So in this case, you're looking at a skew P log T. It was guessing that those tops would be a little bit lower. So the question is, the storm could be moving in a little bit faster than the skewed P log T could have assumed. It could have just been the data at that model. So again, for me, I'm going to look at a whole bunch of information and try to add up, does this look like it's, matching the forecast or not? In this case, I'm guessing that the weather moved in a little bit faster, or the GFA model is predicting it to happen a little bit sooner. Either way, it sure didn't look layered. It just kind of looked like one layer. If we go to Denver, you'll see roughly the same thing. So we'll look at Denver, do this sideline here. They collide right around there. And, they really don't separate to there. And if you even want to give it a little hedge space and just assume that, there was still the possibility of clouds, so they really did diverge, you're up around 12,000 feet. So somewhere around 12,000 feet. And if we look at this, again, looking at this forecast model, tops at 13, tops at 14. So what you kind of see there is that Denver skew T log P kind of matched what you see from the forecast. Now this forecast model shows this happening just a bit. You can see east of Denver. So DIA was really, or Denver International was really on the border. And that's one of the problems when you're dealing with changing weather. Forecasting exactly at the hour where that change is going to happen, when there's a large gradient of clouds, that can be fairly difficult. But again, they never really reconverged. They stayed separate. You didn't see any multiple layers. You didn't see anything but they do kind of match the forecast. So that's another tool you can use. One of the things I really caution people is pilots. We like to become meteorologists, but generally, I know some meteorologist pilots. I'm not one of them. Most of us aren't. So I always am very careful when we're using something like a skew T log P to make sure that if you really don't understand it, you're more using it to make sure to give you okay, I'm on the fence and I'm looking at this. This is a don't go. If the other forecasts look really bad and the skew T looks good, I'm going to hedge in the bet of the other forecasts, unless I have a really know someone with a strong meteorology background, because it's easy to misinterpret those charts. But I bring it up because it is another resource that we can use as pilots. Okay. Colin, looks like we don't have any questions.
No questions about that. We did have a question, and I answered here, though. I thought it'd be good for you to throw it in here. A couple people were asking the app that you were using for the
show you what I use.
Log T. How about we just pull that up and show it right here?
So it's Skew T Log P Pro. It's fairly easy to use. You can enter the airport ID here. So K, let's do Omaha. Because they're... Click chart, pulls the data, And there you get to see the skew P log T. And here you can see a very clear divergence. The temperature and the dew point from the ground all the way up to, probably around 7,000 feet are completely converged. And then they separate out after that. And then they greatly diverge around 25,000 feet. So you can see there's still quite a bit of humidity in the air between, I'd say, 7,000 feet and up to 25,000 feet. And there it really tends to blow out. And again, one of the things I always caution people, again, I'm not a meteorologist. If the lines are close, they could converge. You could end up with 100% relative humidity. You absolutely could end up with a cloud layer there. So just because you see two lines paralleling each other but not touching, that does not mean that you won't find clouds. If you look at that point where they really blast apart at 25,000 feet, that lets you know the temperature and the dew point have diverged greatly. There I wouldn't expect to find any clouds. But, okay, looks like we have a question.
Okay, we do have one in here from Todd, and he said this. In your experience, is the GFA or the color IR more accurate?
That's a really good question. In my experience, the GFA has got a 50-50 shot of being accurate at getting me out of the clouds, especially when I'm dealing with storm systems. Part of that is because in my aircraft, we typically are dealing with tops between 20 and 25,000 feet or 18 and 25,000 feet. And oftentimes we find they go much higher than that. The GFA didn't think about it or didn't predict it is the way I should say it. The color IR satellite I find to be a fairly accurate nowcast. Now, it's still old. Okay, it takes time for that satellite information to come down. I believe it updates. I think it's every hour, but I can't. Maybe let me take a look and see if I can tell you. We'll take a look and check in the chat. I can't remember. Let's see. It's more frequently than once an hour, I think, but I'm not 100% positive. You can tell. Go back to ForeFlightCon. You can tell when the update came down by looking at the. You click on the little time indicator in the top left, and you'll see color IR satellite was at 7:30 p.m. Mountain Standard. So what I found, what I like about the color IR satellite is all of the satellite data is a little old. Okay. And again, the times you see there, that's not the time the satellites scan the clouds. That's after processing, shipping to ForeFlight. That's the date of the data, that's the time of their data. So it's a little older than that. But again, the cloud formations are fairly accurate if the data is fairly new. The winds, I find the temperatures aloft, those models are fairly close. So I find as an observation tool, the color IR satellite combined with the winds aloft is a pretty good way to identify the highest layer of clouds. Where I find myself in trouble is when I'm looking for layers that's underneath something, the color IR satellite's really no help there. And so now pilot reports are your best friend. Pilot reports are the very best. But then, I might go down to the skew P log T or use the GFA. Okay, next question.
Okay, next question is this. Why would you care about the cloud tops? Is it just for ease of flight?
That's a great question. Ease of flight is a real concern. I know that oftentimes we're like, it's fun to be in the soup, which is true. But if you're flying an 8-hour day in a non-autopilot equipped aircraft, single pilot, and you're in the clouds the entire time, that is a long day of flying. So getting out on top of the clouds does ease the workload, and that typically means that you're a safer pilot. You're more relaxed when you go into land. You've got less load throughout the flight. But the biggest concern that I have is typically going to be ice. That's the big issue, ice, ice, ice. And I know in a lot of light aircraft are not equipped for operations in icing at all. As you start to get into aircraft that can operate commercially, but can't get up to 41,000 feet, you're stuck in the 20s and 30s, like a lot of turboprops, you don't want to be in the ice. You want to find your way out. Finally, clouds can be completely smooth, but oftentimes they're not. And I found that getting on top of the clouds oftentimes results in a smoother ride, even if it's stratiform, than it does when I'm in the clouds. So the ride's more comfortable, lower workload, and again, I'm always thinking about, where can I assure that I am out of the ice? And clear air always is out of ice. Okay, next question.
One other thing I'd throw in there is passengers too. Passengers tend to like the view and not like sitting in the soup. Can also make them sick. So
It can.
over a long period of time.
Honestly, it can make pilots sick. It definitely can make passengers sick, unless they're Colin's kids. They like watching the water stream off the airplane.
They love the clouds.
They love the clouds. But yeah, a lot of passengers just don't like being in the clouds.
Okay, well, here's our next question that we have. And that is, I'm curious about strategies for descents or climbs through winter cloud layers, as far as limits on time in the layer. And there's a couple things I'm going to throw here. One for our aircraft, which is icing equipped, and in this particular question, low performance, non-anti-icing equipped aircraft.
Okay, so we were just talking about low performance and our aircraft, and there was some suspected freezing drizzle, though it wasn't forecast. It happened at an airport kind of that we were going to, and the question was, do you go there and land, or do you go somewhere else? And there wasn't anything reported, but you looked at the weather and kind of made it easily could have been on the border. And one of the things that I always try to keep in mind is, even in an anti-icing approved airplane, climbing can be difficult in ice, especially if you pick up severe ice. You'll hear people call it heavy ice. It's either light, trace, light, moderate, or severe. In severe ice, that airplane can be loaded with weight, and climbing can be impossible. So I always say, no matter what kind of airplane you're flying, even a single-engine turboprop, be careful, because an iced up airplane is very quickly a low performance airplane. And ice will accrue to parts that don't have de-icing protection. So wheel pants and parts of the aircraft structure. And that all adds weight and drag from form drag. The shape adds weight, or not weight, but drag. So slows you down, kills your climb performance. In our airplane, I like to know the tops and the bottoms, and then I immediately assess the intensity, and we have a timer. We know how much fuel or fluid is in our system, and so that gives us a duration for operating both on normal, which handles light to moderate, high, which handles moderate, and max, which handles severe. And severe ice is almost always supercooled large droplets, so either convective clouds or that clear ice thing that you get from about -2 to maybe -15 Celsius, where you just turn into an ice box as you fly through it. That can be in freezing rain, freezing drizzle, any of that stuff. That can always end up in there. Anyway, so number one, I'm always watching the time. I know what time I entered an icing layer, and I refuse to stay in an icing layer. If it is light and I'm being vectored to land, I will stay at that altitude if I know that I'm close to landing, because my de-icing system, and I have lots of de-icing time, but I'm always thinking about not just how much time I need to get into the airport, but if I have to execute a missed approach and a second approach somewhere else, I need to make sure I've got enough icing fluid left for that. Again, normally I do, that's not an issue. But light, I'm kind of running the clock there. As soon as I get into moderate, I'm looking for another altitude. Whether that's lower or higher, I'm not going to stay there. And the beautiful thing about ATC is that you can simply tell them, and they're really good at letting you change altitudes, especially in a light piston aircraft. You need to let them know what's going on. We had a case coming into Denver where they asked us to climb 1,000 feet for traffic over Fort Collins. We went from trace to light to steady moderate, right, Colin?
Yeah, it got, and it was, I would say, for 30 seconds or less before we descended back down, it was probably even bordering on severe.
It started to border on severe, exactly. And immediately right away I called center, or called approach control, let them know, said, hey, 6 Bravo Delta, temperature is this, we're picking up moderate ice right now. We could stay here for a minute or two, but not much longer. And then right as they started to give us a descent, which he came back right away, gave us a different heading and a descent, that's when it really started to accumulate. But again, as I said, those icing layers are typically fairly defined and thin. We went down 1,000 feet, and we went from moderate that was turning into severe as we moved west to none at all. There was no icing at all, just by descending 1,000 feet. So I'm going to start changing altitudes right away. And I know the temperature profile, and I'm listening to the pilot reports that are going on up there. Again, as a pilot operating in an icing area, you're listening to other people and what they're picking up, because they're telling you, even in a piston is a challenge in ice, but so is a turboprop, so is an airliner, You won't meet a single professional pilot who likes the idea of sitting in it. So we're looking at that. Um, and then for approaches, if I'm on top of a layer, and that happens a lot. Oftentimes, icing happens in fairly warm layers that are oftentimes, the tops are not that high, maybe 10,000, 11,000 feet. ATC sometimes tries to descend you down further out. Again, they don't know your limitations. They're relying on you to tell them. So I'll typically come back and stay above the layer as long as possible. My idea is to just dive through. And then I always, as I said, always have altitudes to go out. So, I know if I can get back to this altitude, I can get myself out of the ice. I'm constantly thinking about that. The best way to say it, when we talk about personal limits, icing is such an unpredictable beast. Unless it's a thunderstorm, and then you're definitely going to get it. Icing is such an unpredictable beast that as a pilot, you never want to stay in it because that time goes by so fast and you've got it all over places you can't see, your landing gear, all kinds of parts of the airplane, and it's generated weight. And by the time you recognize that it's generating weight and drag, it's very difficult to take care of that problem. That's by the time you can feel it, you're in trouble. So, I'm always trying to get out of it. And I'll stay above the clouds as long as possible if I know it's in there. And then when I'm evaluating, hey, do I go to my destination? They're reporting severe ice. They're, or it looks like it's starting to develop. The first question I'm always going to ask is, what are my chances that I'm going to get stuck in this on a missed approach procedure? Or, not just ATC, but am I going to have enough power if I go missed to get the airplane out of the clouds? And if that's in doubt, I'm always going to take the airplane to a better weather airport and wait. And Colin can attest. I mean, when you're flying a light aircraft, 99% of the time we're able to get to our destination. Maybe not that much, 95. And 5% of the time we stay somewhere else and have a really good time and come back in the morning. So, okay, next question.
Okay, next one. I don't have it up on the screen, but I'm just going to throw it out there. Anthony Borda wanted to know if there's a way you can get the listing of the locations where they launched those radiosondes. And I know you looked at that up earlier. Did they have cities on there or not?
If you search for NWS radiosonde locations on Google, I don't have a listing myself, but I know if you Google like National Weather Service radiosonde locations, that would give you, I'm sure, a list of those locations. I know that the NWS reports that, so you could go see that. This is something that we're going to do in more depth. And again, I always caution people with things, National Weather Service products that aren't meant for aviators. Quick knowledge is oftentimes dangerous knowledge. They're better to use, as I said, using a radiosonde with basic knowledge saying, okay, this is telling me the weather's too bad to fly. That's much wiser than looking at it and saying, wow, everything else looks bad, but I think the radiosonde looks good. I'm going to give it a shot. All of that being said, we're going to do a lot more content, partnering with people with expertise in the field and talking about this. Because as you get into instrument flying, summer or winter, weather is just such a big concern. And we have incredible tools right now, but understanding the atmosphere and what's going on really makes it a lot easier to fly. Okay, that's all the time that we've got for tonight. We will be back in another 2 weeks. We don't have a topic for the next Bold Method Live. So either in the comments or through email, let us know what you'd like us to talk about. And we'll see you in 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. Have a great holiday. Good night.